Here we're going to look at the joints of the body, a very important part of physical training. The muscles move the joints ultimately, and that's how we move and exercise. In this section we're going to cover different types of joint. We're going to focus on what's called a synovial joint and then describe the structures of it and recognise any possible joint actions at the different joints. Particularly this last thing is very useful when you're training people. Ultimately muscles will have an action, and by knowing what joints do, you can know what muscles are working in each exercise. So let's start by looking at what a joint is. So in very simple terms, a joint is where two or more bones meet or join. They allow the body to move, and they allow also things to fit together and not move occasionally too. So look at the different types of joints that we can see in the body. So one type of joint is what's called a fibrous joint or a movable joint. So the idea here is that two bones have moved, but actually they no longer articulate, they just lock together. So you see that in the skull particularly, you've got various different bones. There's a bone here, bone here, bone here, and they lock together and form a tight protective surface for the brain. You also get it in the hip and other parts of the body. So a fibrous joint is immovable. There are two bones joined together, but there's no longer movement. In a cartilaginous joint, as the name suggests, there is cartilage in between the bones, and the cartilage then allows some movement. It's fairly stiff, but it does allow some movement to occur. So we often refer to these as semi-movable joints. So vertebrae are a good example here. So they can shift a little bit on this axis here. And lastly, ones we're most interested in is our synovial joints, your knee, your hip, your elbow, your wrist. We generally get quite a lot of movement. The type of synovial joint will dictate what direction, how much movement that is. So before we go on, maybe just stand up, move your body, see what moves. And generally you find anything that moves in your body is a synovial joint, with the possible exception of your spine. When we're looking at a synovial joint, there are always some similar features. So there's always same features in a synovial joint. So here's an example when we've got our two bone ends, and around the ends of the bone we've got our higher line or articular cartilage. You may remember that from previously. The idea here is it sits in between the bone surfaces. It's very slippery, allows the bone to move, or the bones to move against each other without wearing down the bone. You'll also notice there's then a capsule. So there's always a capsule around the joint, which brings the bones together. And on the inside of the capsule, there's something which we call a synovial membrane. Synovial membrane. So here's, but the capsule then forms a cavity around the joint, and then our membrane then, you can see it here in green, will then release synovial fluid into the middle here. Okay, so that means we've got now both a smooth surface and we've got a liquid which lubricates the middle of the joint there. So that helps it to move, but we don't want it to move too much, so we've also got some ligament structures. So ligaments link bone to bone, ligaments link bone to bone. This one here is called an extracapular ligament because it's outside. Sometimes you find them inside, and sometimes you find them actually in the joint capsule. So you'll always find any synovial joint has hyaline cartilage, it has ligaments, it has fibrous capsule, has a synovial membrane that secretes synovial fluid into the joint. One of the reasons why we warm up, particularly as you get older, is to mobilize the joint and get synovial fluid moving. Let's have a look at the different types. There are 6 types of synovial joint. Just by moving your body around, you might get an idea, but the shape of the joint will affect how it moves. So let's firstly look at a ball and socket joint. So generally in a ball and socket joint, there's a ball at the end of the bone, and it fits into a socket. So here you can see it in the hip. There's our ball, there's our socket, and if you notice, if you move your leg around, it can move in lots of different directions. It can come out to the side, forwards and backwards. It can twist around in the capsule. So you generally get that in a ball and socket joint, because it's a ball can roll pretty much in any direction, so therefore you get a lot of movement here. So the hip and the shoulder are both ball and socket joints. The hip has a deeper socket, which makes it more stable, and the shoulder has a shallower socket, which makes it more mobile. Another common one is a hinge. So just like your door will move all the way open, but only in one direction. So you find with a hinge joint, it moves just in one plane, but it's often got quite a lot of movement. So this here's a knee, obviously, but also your elbow, your fingers, various other joints in your body are synovial hinge joints. There's a couple of pivot joints. So pivot joints, as the name suggests, allow a rotation movement. So this one here is right at the top of your neck. This is your what's called C1, or your atlas bone, and this is your C2, also known as your axis. We've got another synovial pivot joint, which is in the radio-ulnar joint, so it joins the radius and the ulnar, and you'll notice that the radius can spin around. That enables you to turn your palm up, turn your palm down, which we call supination and pronation. Okay, so this one enables your head to turn in a shaking head movement, and then the radio-ulnar joint allows you to flip over, supination and pronation. So they are both synovial pivot joints. We've also got a saddle joint in the thumb, so that enables you to move the thumb out to the side, but also forwards and backwards. So it's quite useful in opposing the thumb. So that's the one you need to know. This is the saddle joint. Condyloid, or sometimes we call that an ellipsoid joint, which is quite interesting. So because it's got a roundish surface, you're able to move forwards and backwards, and also you're able to what's called circumduct, so you're able to spin round, but what you can't do is actually rotate within the joint. Okay, so generally you can move forwards and backwards, side to side, and you can almost draw a circle with the joint, but what you can't do is rotate around. Okay, so you tend to find these in the metacarpophalangeal joints here in the knuckles, and also in the wrist. Difficult one to explain this, but the gliding joint there is generally those two joints coming together. They don't move in any particular direction. They just slide around to adjust while other things move. So here's one called the acromioclavicular joint, acromioclavicular. And as you lift your arm up in the air, you'll feel that it just needs to adjust to allow that to move. Okay, you've got other ones between the joints in your foot and hands. So hopefully you've got an idea then of the 6 types of synovial joints. And then what happens then is there are a series of actions that can take place in various parts of the body. So these are the general categories. So you can have flexion and extension, which basically means this is a flexion when a joint comes closer together, generally in a forwards direction, and extension when a body part straightens, generally in a forwards and backwards direction. Abduction is when a body part moves outwards, so sideways away from the midline to the body, and adduction is when you move that back towards the midline. So one way of remember that is you add together. You add together. When we've got a rotation, it's the joint actually spinning around an axis within the joint. Circumduction is a cone-shaped movement from the joint spinning outwards. So it's like drawing a circle, but not actually rotating around in the joint. Lateral flexion is bending to the side. Lateral extension is returning from that bent position. Horizontal flexion is moving along a horizontal plane. So say you've got your arm out to the side and you then point in front of you, you would be horizontally flexing. If you wanted to then point to something behind you, again moving along the horizon, that would be horizontal extension. If we move a body part up, we would call it elevation. So think about shrugging your shoulders. Depression, when we move it down. So again, think about moving your shoulders down again. A protraction is when we jut something forward. Again, your shoulders can protract. and then you can also retract when you move them backwards. There are some specific ones for the ankle. So when we plantar flex, we point the toes down, and when we dorsiflex, we bring the toes up. Plantar flex down, toes towards the plants, good way of remembering that, and dorsiflex when the toes come up. We can also pronate, where we turn the palm down. We can supinate, where we turn the palm up. So we pronate, supinate, and then these ones are specific to the ankle, so we can do inversion, which is moving the sole of the foot to face inwards, and eversion when it faces outwards. So when the soles of your feet are pointing towards each other, they're in inversion, and if they're pointing away from each other, they are in eversion. So have a look either on your own or with a partner. See if you can move some of the joints. So see if you can move your neck joint, your spine, your hip, shoulder, knee, elbow, wrist and ankle, and see if you can demonstrate what movements they are. So say you move your spine, right, twisting around, that would be a rotation. Okay, and if you brought your hip out to the side, your leg out to the side from your hip, that would be abduction. So see if you can name as many of those as you can. Another skill is to be able to relate these two exercises. There's actually a task here on the classroom you can look at. But if you just take an exercise, perform the movement, and then try and work out which joints are moving. So if you can work out which joints are moving, and you can work out which way they are moving, and if you want, you can record that and then you can talk over it. So for example, if you're doing a bicep curl, the elbow would be flexing. If we're doing a bicep curl, the elbow would be flexing. Now obviously you find if you do more complicated exercise, more than one joint might move. Okay. So hopefully now you're able to name the different types of joint, identify different types of synovial joint, describe structures of a synovial joint, and recognise different actions are possible. Remember to check out the Kahoots, test yourself regularly, label skeletons, try out the joints, movements for when you're training and anytime you want, even when you're standing at a bus stop. Make a skeleton from toothpicks and marshmallows. That's quite a fun thing to do. A bit ambitious, but it's a good way to spend the afternoon. It does give you a good idea of where the joints are in the body and what they do. And then stick with it, guys. Even if you're finding it tough, stick in there and keep learning.